So, an ex-Battlefield 2042 dev spoke out not too long ago on a podcast called the Drawcall podcast. And they gave a really great insight to what development was like in the studio, and I just wanted to share a few bits and pieces with you here because it raises some really interesting questions and opens your eyes to the mistakes that were made, actually, and how hard it is to develop a game like Battlefield. And when I heard what he had to say, I was really surprised how open and honest he was about the project. So if you want to listen to the full podcast, I will leave a link in the bio below. But if you just want to break down on what the developer said, then stick around and hit the like button if you go on to do so. And feel free to subscribe as well whilst you're here. Alright though, let's jump into this straight away. So who is the developer in question then? Well, his name is Hejl, and you may have already heard of him actually, he's pretty well known. Now, his main focus is a rendering engineer, but he has also done many other roles in development outside of EA. He specializes in game performance and streamlining resources. He's also worked on games like Need for Speed, I think it was, he said, and this will be an important fact in just a moment. He's now what I gathered to be a freelance developer that jumps into projects for specialist situations, so I mean that's clearly awesome, and he's clearly extremely talented as well. So what did this guy have to say about his time in EA then, and what was he actually tasked to do during that time? Well, they hired him to fix some unknown performance issues because, as we know, there was a fair few of them even after launch, and he goes into detail on what kind of issues he had to deal with during his time there, and there were a fair few, and they're very interesting. So the first thing he mentions is that the devs there were carelessly dumping more and more assets into the game, one because they were rushing, and the game was just so big, so they were just getting things done as quickly as they possibly could. Now, this would obviously mean they'd have to reprofile assets all the time just to put out fires, creating new bugs, and just creating a long list of things to do purely because the workflow just wasn't efficient enough. But one of the major issues that he was actually tasked and brought in for wasn't just to put out random fires here and there. His main task was actually to look into the UI in the game. The UI in the game was apparently extremely over budget, which he said was strange and was really silly stuff when he actually found the cause of the issue. Because he goes on to say that it's supposed to be really simple stuff, you know, especially in an FPS game. You don't want your UI to be super cluttered and complex, so it really shouldn't be an issue that it's going to take up so many resources. He's actually quoted say like, come on guys, how did this even happen? And he was really shocked and surprised when he saw the main reason for this. Now, he had experience in creating profiles for vehicles, so they got him to look at the vehicles in Battlefield 2042. Now, the vehicles are already created by a separate kind of development team. I think they worked on the Burnout franchise, which is the reason the cars actually feel really great in the game, and you can really tell they put a lot of work into them. But the issue is that they made the game run really, really slow. As I say, the main cause of this was the performance issues, and they had no idea why. So of course they asked Jim to go have a look at it and answer that question. So what did he do? He ran a load of tests, and he decided to load a ton of cars into an empty space to analyze the budget that was being used there. And what he found is that it was the UI once again. What it was the indicator that was above the actual vehicle itself. So a little tiny dot. I think it's a triangle in this one. I can't remember, but it's the little tiny orange or blue icon that pops up above a vehicle that indicates whether it's empty, being used by friendly, being used by an enemy, or whatever it might be. And this was actually doubling the cost for the vehicle. So it was like having another vehicle on top of that said vehicle. So when you've got a load of them in a map, so say you got 10 vehicles in a map, it actually felt like you were trying to run 20. And then begs the question, well, how did they not know this already? You know? And the main reason they said is because vehicles felt so good and so well polished, they just didn't have a look into it. They didn't want to look into it because they presumed everything was okay. And then no one decided to check the UI because, again, the UI is supposed to be simple. So again, you can kind of see this cycle repeating itself of just underestimating the simple things. And that's exactly what Jim came in and did. He just, first of all, looked at the most simple and obvious answer, and that was usually the case, and he usually managed to fix it that way. So that was done, and it was on to the next big issue. Now, they had a massive issue with the facial animations and keeping it all in budget. You know, when a character is jumping, running, hurt, or anything like that, you see the facial expression on the character change to add that bit of immersion and a bit more detail. So when they're jumping from 64 players to 128, they just weren't prepared for this. It was a massive leap anyway, just in the gameplay perspective, because they just weren't used to it, and adding the facial animations on top is really just going to cause even more issues. The main problem they faced is that they didn't know how to calculate the LOD, or the level of detail per individual player, so the smoothness and detail of the animation that other players would be able to see whilst they're running around in the map. They didn't know whether a player from 20 meters could see a facial animation, or 50 meters, or 100, what it should be, and this again, seems like a relatively easy thing to calculate if you've got experience in the matter. So it could just come down to the experience of the team that was dealing with this. Because facial animations have been in every single Battlefield game, right? Obviously, it's just on a larger scale and a bit more detailed, which you'd kind of expect to happen with every new iteration of a game. So I don't feel like it's something they should be that unprepared for unless they just weren't experienced. He said it took them a long time to actually solve this issue. It was actually only in the alpha that it was fixed, and they decided to really dial down on the facial animations. And to be honest, we even get glitches today in some areas. If you have a freeze frame, you'll probably seen it on Twitter and things like that, of facial animations being warped, just looking really strange. He does go on to say, though, it's not all negative, and I don't want to make this a complete negative rant, but he does go on to say how good it started to feel when everything started to come together and started to function. Now, he was worried because it was only 5 months away from release that started to be the case, but by that point, they did start to see real progress, and that is one of the best moments in the development process, he says, you can experience and you can feel. Another big problem, he goes on to say, is how they had to integrate the previous generation into the mix as well. He said it was a massive achievement when they actually got it down. They managed to hit the frame rate target and the resolution target. Obviously, they had to make some compromises here and there, and that's kind of going to be an issue with a lot of these cross-gen games, and I think they actually did a really good job with the previous generations. Everyone knows it's going to be kind of half a game rather than the full experience, and I think that's what they got. I mean, they're working with really limited hardware, and the full game struggles to run on the next-gen consoles, or the current-gen consoles, rather. So, yeah, I actually agree with them there. I think they did a really good job. And then came another massive kicker after that point, is they decided to implement what they call an AA solution, anti-aliasing solution, that takes into account motion vectors. To put this in extremely simple terms, anti-aliasing is what makes jagged edges really smooth, and it can be quite intense and resource heavy in some cases. Now, they wanted an AA solution that's just as effective on dynamic objects that can be moved or can break, to make them look better in motion, just to make them look correct. Which, in theory, sounds like a good idea, but it's only really used in smaller environments because of how taxing it can be. It then meant they had to re-render every object in the game that could be moved to implement this AA solution, which they didn't actually know until they implemented it. So they made the decision, be like, yeah, this is a great idea, and then later on down the line, it's like, we're going to have to re-render all this stuff now, and that's going to take a long time to do. But it was too late. They had already made the decision. They're going to have to go ahead with it. And then you take into account that there's a lot of objects in Battlefield 2042 that can move or explode or break apart. And it just goes to show the amount of work they had to do to basically go over everything again and do the work they had already done, repeat everything. On top of that, they then decided to add the storm idea, which means all those objects would move at the same time. From trees blowing in gale force winds to debris flying through the air, they all had to be rendered with this new solution. And when they're all moving at the same time, it means they've got to do some magic to make sure that that doesn't absolutely crash the game and tank the performance. And as I said before, it's going to add a ton of more work, and apparently it raised a load more bugs. And this leads us over to the next topic. During this time, they had to move devs from other areas and other projects over to the bug squashing department. And he said he's never seen so many people involved in that area of the game before. He had a Slack channel with over 200 people in there looking into fixing the bugs or management or anything like that. Obviously, not every single person was there to squash bugs, but the majority of them were, and the other were, managing the people within that and feeding the information back to the higher ups and things like this. But it's a lot of people, 200 people, just to squash bugs. Considering how many bugs there actually were in the finished game, they probably needed more. He then wraps up the section by talking about his opinion on the Frostbite engine. So this is towards the end of the actual EA section, but I just wanted to include this because it makes a lot of sense, and it's been repeated a few times actually. So I've heard that it's not great to work on the Frostbite engine at all, and they've implemented it into FIFA now, the other sports games, and it's always been for a long time, it's been a part of Battlefield, and it's done a great job. But he makes a really good point and says that it's an old way to develop games now. Having your own engine back in the day was seemed as a bit of an advantage. You could have your own implementations, you could have your own technology that no other game could achieve unless they copied your idea or implemented it into their own engine. But that's just not the case anymore, because a lot of the off-the-shelf engines like Unity, Unreal, they all come with these tools anyway, and we've kind of plateaued in the extreme variants of engines that can do these different things, and they're all kind of packaged into one these days. The example that he gives, and he kind of puts things into perspective, is like hiring someone who's a professional photo editor, right? And they've practiced for years and they've mastered the Adobe set of programs like Photoshop, Lightroom, etc. And then you hire them and you tell them that they have to use a program that you've made yourself, and it's just completely different. The layout's completely different, and it's just simply not as good. And you go throw them in there and go, okay, edit this photo for me. Now, I'm sure they'd do a great job, but it'd make their life a lot more difficult. And it probably wouldn't be as good as if they use something they're comfortable with. Now, it is a bit of a blanket statement, and you can't expect every game to be on the same engine or anything like that. But there's a reason why these proprietary engines are being phased out. I mean, you just have to look at the last 2 FPS games that have been released, really, of recent times that have had issues. Obviously, Battlefield 2042, we just covered that one, but also Halo Infinite. They've got their new engine in that one, and everyone is saying how difficult it is to actually develop on. And it might not be the fact that it's just difficult, it might just be the fact that no one's used to it and no one's got any experience on it. And both of these games reek of development teams that lack experience. I don't know whether that's actually the case, but that's the way it seems. And after this conversation that Jim has had, it kind of feels that way. Anyway, I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but that's about it. That's the majority of what he mentions. And when he's talking about his time with EA, I thought it was just really interesting. It's a really good bit of insight on the side of development that we don't really get to hear. I wish that more developers spoke out, or there was more kind of documentaries on gaming, actually. You see it with films all the time. I think he actually mentions that you see a lot of behind the scenes making with series of films, but you never really see it with games. And there's a massive disconnect between the player base of these games and then the actual developers and the work that goes in behind it. So I think if they're a bit more open with what they had to go through, even if it was bad, then it would make us a bit more understanding. And it made me a bit more understanding when I look at this game now, but obviously it's still very frustrating that it wasn't as good as we all wished it could be. But it makes you kind of empathetic and sympathetic towards these people that, I mean, it's not their fault, is it? We all know that deep down, but actually seeing that and hearing it straight from the horse's mouth goes a long way, I feel. Obviously, take everything with a pinch of salt. It is just one person's experience working on the project, but a lot of what he says does make sense, and it does line up with the state of the game at the moment as well. But go listen to the rest of the podcast also. It's really good, and if you're interested in podcasts anyway, then just add it to your list. But that's it from you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button as well if you could, and hope you have a good day. Until next time, cheers.